bits of, even Italian thistle and other things. So just be real watchful. And otherwise, I think we will go ahead and move into our speaker. We're very excited about this talk because our chapter was very involved back in 2019 with organizing and having lots of volunteers out there with the community, doing some work before the prescribed burn in Caples. And so it's really exciting now to hear some of the things they've already found since the Caldor fire of the Caples Creek area prescribed burn, its effect on the Caldor fire, and also on forest health. And so without further ado, I'm going to let Lester Lubetkin, one of our two conservation chairs, go ahead and introduce our two speakers who we are very excited to have with us today.
Okay, thank you, Alice. Well, it's a real pleasure to get to introduce tonight's speakers, both Becky, Estes, and Scott Daly. Both Becky and Scott have a wealth of information and knowledge that they're going to be able to share with us this evening. Becky will be doing most of the speaking, but Scott, who's done a lot of the work, some of the background work, will also be available for questions and whatnot. Becky has lived in Placerville and served as the Forest Service Central Sierra Province ecologist for the last 10 years, working on the El Dorado Forest as well as the Tahoe, the Stanislaus, and the Lake Tahoe Basin National Management Unit. Prior to working in the Sierra Nevada, Becky had been working at the Pacific Southwest Research Station in Redding, another arm of the Forest Service, studying questions associated with Mediterranean climates. And she completed her undergraduate work at the University of the South in Tennessee, and then continued her education at Auburn University in Alabama. She completed her master's and PhD in forestry there in Alabama, and in 2006. She now assists forests with a number of complex management needs in the province and in the region, including the importance of managing post-fire landscapes to ensure future resilience in the face of a changing climate. Scott Daly is a fire ecologist working with the Forest Service in a kind of unique capacity in what's called the Enterprise Program, and he's been there since 2001. He currently lives and works in Reno, Nevada, having previously worked for the Forest Service on the El Dorado Forest, on the Tahoe National Forest, and also on the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit. So he's very familiar with this area. His work is focused on better understanding fire behavior and fire effects for land management decisions aimed at improving ecological health and community protection. Scott's been an active member of the Fire Behavior Assessment Team, or the FBAT, since 2003, and that Fire Behavior Assessment Team is a multi-agency research group that collects data on active wildfires. And with that, we welcome Scott and Becky. Thank you very much for speaking with us this evening.
Yeah, glad to be here. So I'm going to share my screen. So I want you to let me know if you're seeing the presentation, and then let's see, make sure we're seeing the right slide. So is everybody seeing the slide without any notes on it?
Yes, that looks good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Lester, for that introduction. Yeah, so there's not much need for me to tell you much more about the position that I'm in. I work for the Forest Service, and then Scott Daly is one of the co-authors on this presentation. And I also just want to recognize Kirsten Bovey, who's been working within the province as an associate province ecologist. It's super helpful in helping analyze this data and really crunch out some good spatial analysis for us. It's sort of this initial take on whether or not and how the Caples 2019 Caples fire was resilient within the 2021 Caldor fire. So I really appreciate everybody's interest in this. I understand that there's a lot of discussion and likely questions on the Caldor fire. So I really just wanted to begin to talk a little bit about an overview of what this presentation will be about today. For the majority of this talk, we're going to be focused on the Caples project and really beginning to discuss the effectiveness, both from a fire management perspective briefly, and then also to present preliminary results from the ecological perspective. I also want to begin just giving everybody a brief overview of fire in the Sierra Nevada, just so we're all on the same page, before I sort of launch into talking about some of the post-fire Caples landscape, so after the 2019 Caples fire. So we're going to talk a little bit about those results, and then we're going to look at some of the initial results evaluating the effectiveness of the Caples fire within the 2021 Caldor fire footprint. The one thing that I really just want to encourage everybody on, since we only have an hour, so I'm not going to really dig too much into the results from the 2019 post-fire Caples landscape. We hosted a webinar, I think it was spring of last year, with the California Fire Science Consortium. And I don't know if that link went out to the group, but if maybe Scott, you could drop that as a link in the chat. I encourage people to watch that. It really takes a deeper dive into evaluating the 19 Caples fire effects. And it also talks a little bit about some of the legacy tree work that Lester mentioned at the beginning, that a lot of people were volunteers, and it was a really large effort. So I encourage you to watch that. All righty, so let's get started. So before we sort of launch into talking about the Caples-Caldor interactions, I thought it would just be a good idea for us to just briefly review fire in California and in the Sierra Nevada. And I really think to understand current patterns of fire across this region, we really need to look at historical patterns. So one way we do this is to look at fire departure. And so to gather those information sources that provide, historical records, we look to not just, past landscapes, but also current reference landscapes, such as those that are available in the park system, such as Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon. So here, represented in this figure, let me get I have to move you guys out of the way so I can turn on a laser pointer here, so you can see me moving around the screen. Okay, so this figure essentially shows us fire return interval departure across the entire state of California. And I just want to point out that we have this area, the cool colors, that really show us where on the landscape we have a severe lack of fire over the last 100 years. And so that ranges from sort of the light blue into the dark blue colors. In contrast, in Southern California, where we have sort of this warmer colors, the yellow colors, which range from that light yellow to the red, this is really showing us where we have much more fire across the landscape over the last 100 years. And this is all compared to pre-Euro-American historical records. And so I think we're all very familiar with those landscapes that are experiencing less fire. Those are the landscapes that are really dominant in the Sierra Nevada, such as oak woodland, yellow pine, and mixed conifer forests. And then those systems in Southern California that are experiencing more fire are those dominated by sort of our shrub communities, our chaparral, our sage scrub, our desert mixed shrublands, and our sagebrush. So now if we dig a little bit deeper, just to understand sort of what's happening currently and look at what's happened historically, just in the Sierra Nevada. And this really separates it out by our vegetation type. So think about our elevation bands in the Sierra Nevada and how we have our oak woodland, which is sort of at our lower elevation band, and then our subalpine conifer, which is at our higher elevation band. And in this blue bar here, we have the pre-settlement fire return interval. So you see a lot of these like lower elevation from oak woodland up to our moist mixed conifer forest types have a pre-settlement fire return interval that's pretty low. So really these landscapes were burning every 11 to 15 years, so pretty frequently. So the other thing to note is as we move up in elevation, that fire return interval really increases. So one of the, I think, trends that it's going to be a theme throughout this entire talk is really just the change in high severity fire. And that's something that was not really present in historical records. So if we look at the red bar here, which is pre-settlement high severity fire percentage, and once again, this is across all of the vegetation types, you can see it's relatively low. But when we compare that to sort of our current high severity fire condition, the percent across the landscape, you can see in these lower elevation forests, there's quite a departure between current and pre-settlement high fire severity. And so that really tells us that something is happening at these lower elevation forests, which is in contrast to higher elevation where those red fir, lodgepole pine, and subalpine forests, we're not seeing a huge difference between the current high severity fire and the pre-settlement high severity fire. So that just puts it into context historically what fire regimes would have been like in this landscape. So now let's sort of fast forward to current conditions and think about, and I think this chart is pretty telling in my mind. This is the top 20 largest California wildfires, and 16 of the 20 largest California wildfires have occurred in the last 20 years. If you look at this table, you'll notice some of them on here almost immediately. There's the Caldor fire, number 15, the Dixie fire, number 2. You'll probably recognize some from years past, the Rim fire, which was on the Stanislaus National Forest. And then there's a number of fires that have occurred on the Mendocino National Forest in the last couple of years that make it into that top 16. So, something really interesting is happening across the landscape when we, regard the current fire condition. And so I just want to talk about a little bit about some of those trends that we're seeing, just to put it in perspective for the rest of the talk. So one thing that's come out and has been published by Scott Stevens et al. In the past is just looking at the number of acres that would have burned historically in Euro-American, prior to Euro-American presence. And that would have been equivalent to about 4.5 million acres, or about 18,000 square kilometers annually, which is a lot of fire. So then if we actually look at the records that we have that show us annual acres burned from about 1980 to present, you can see that the past couple of years, we've really been jumping up. And in 2020, we had over 16,000 square kilometers burned, which is equivalent to about 4 million acres. And so really in the last couple of years, we're sort of approaching that threshold of acres burned in pre-Euro-American. But I think the real thing to focus in on here isn't the number of acres burned, but how those acres are burning. So the one thing to note is, and I think probably most of us know this, we've probably seen landscapes, pictures of post-fire landscapes, particularly in some of these recent fires where, whole areas have been consumed. And typically we refer to that as high severity fire. And so even though the number of acres burning is quite substantial, the way those acres are burning is what's really of consequence in this current landscape. So in this figure right here, which was some work done by Malik et al. In 2013 and is currently being redone by Williams et al. In 2021 to reevaluate fires up until more recent occurrence. You can see that across the 80s into the more recent occurrence, we've had a general increase in the number of hectares burned in high severity fire. And if we compare that, so one of the things we typically do is we use the natural range of variability to help us understand sort of where we're departed. And in this case, we determined a natural range of variability for high severity fire, which is this gray bar right in here. And you can see that almost all of our more recent fires in the last 30 years exceeds the natural range of variability. So typically, high severity fire is greater than 30% of the fire in our current conditions, whereas historically it would have been 3 to 8%. And we're going to see that as sort of a recurring theme throughout this presentation when we start to talk about the Caldor fire. So what does this mean? Well, I think that's sort of the bigger conversation here. Like, those are some of the trends that we're seeing in our current fire conditions. And, what are the impacts that we're going to see ecologically on our forest communities and our other vegetation types? And one real thing that I think is quite telling, and this is a picture in the lower left-hand corner of the King Fire in the Rubicon drainage. And you can see that that's a huge area of high severity. All the trees are black. And so one of the consequences of this is that as high severity increases, our patch size is also increasing. And because of that, it's well beyond the typical size for conifer seed dispersal. So we're seeing less conifers come up in those landscapes. And as a result of that, particularly in the King Fire, reforestation needs, artificial reforestation needs quadrupled as a result of that high severity fire. And so I just want everybody to sort of keep this in your mind as we sort of move through the rest of the presentation. I think we're going to have some probably some thought-provoking questions that might go through our minds as we move through the discussion. So hopefully that gives everybody a pretty good background of sort of, past fire, historical fire compared to current conditions, sort of where we're seeing changes in the landscape and how this is impacting our ecological function across the Sierra Nevada. And so now I want to segue and I want to talk about the Caples Creek watershed. And so I know a lot of you have, volunteered on this project, maybe were involved in this project from the very beginning. It sort of came about in 2011 with a whole host of partners for a number of reasons. And you can see here the location of the Caples Fire, and then the Caples Creek watershed sort of surrounds the Caples Fire area. And part of the importance of the Caples Creek watershed, or the reason why it was a huge focus for ecological restoration, one of the main reasons was that it's a main source of drinking water. And so one of our partners throughout this process has been the Dorado Irrigation District. And so the intent was really to reduce any high severity effects on the soil and the vegetation. And some of the other major important components of this watershed is just ecosystem diversity. And so it's a diverse landscape. I don't know if folks have been out there. I highly encourage you to spend some time in the Caples Creek area, particularly once it's opened back up to recreation. But there's meadows, aspen, chaparral, the large legacy trees, a range of vegetation types from Sierra mixed conifer to red fir and lodgepole at higher elevations. One other component of this watershed is that it's largely roadless, so it had very little impact on past management in this landscape. Okay, so with that being said, I want to bump back to just taking a sort of a closer look at the fire return interval departure within the Caples Creek watershed. So if you recall that California region-wide map where we looked at departure, and it showed the whole Sierra Nevada largely in shades of blue. In other words, a lot less fire in the landscape. If we zoom into just the Caples Creek watershed, we can see here that it ranges from a high departure in the dark red, primarily at those lower elevation mixed conifer forests, where historically fire would have occurred every 11 to 16 years. And this is evidence, if you look over to the right, there's a picture of a fire scar, and those are quite common on the landscape. So fire was a quite common occurrence in this landscape. And then at the higher elevations in the more eastern portion of the watershed, you can see we sort of range from a moderate to low departure. And those are really our more subalpine forests. And there's a lot of granitics interspersed in here. Oh, and I guess one other thing that I just wanted to point out with regards to this, although there's been little management in this area, fire exclusion is quite evident over the last century. There have been a number of light ignitions within this landscape that were extinguished over the last 100 years. Okay, so another reason and importance for prioritizing this landscape for restoration treatments was a better understanding of the stand variables. And once again, I'll throw out this term, the natural range of variability. And this is essentially a way that we were able to fine tune our targets for restoration within this landscape. And essentially, we have the natural range of variability here, and this might be hard for folks to read. And then the Caples Creek metrics here. And there's a number of stand variables. I'm not going to go through all of them. But for an example, we have tree density. And so you can see that within Caples Creek, we have many more trees per acre as compared to the natural range of variability. So by utilizing this sort of comparison, we were able to really detail and define targets for restoration within this landscape. Okay, so after all this work was done and a lot of the sort of the planning efforts were complete, the ecological restoration project was developed. And there were a number of objectives that were focused within this landscape, from watershed and forest health improvement, reduction of hazardous fuel accumulation, meadow restoration, improvement of conditions for aspen and oaks, and improvement of public safety. And a lot of work went into developing this project. And as you can see here, this was sort of some of the initial maps that were created, focusing on the project area. So there was about 8,800 acres of prescribed burning proposed. 4,400 was in the western portion. This was largely broadcast burning. And then in the eastern portion, 4,400 was large vegetative island burning. So this was all the initial planning of the Caples Creek Ecological Restoration project. And a lot of work went on in preparation for this prescribed burning project. We had site preparation, such as infrastructure protection, old growth tree raking, fire line construction, removal of ladder fuels and piles. Prescribed burning happened on the northern portion of the fire area, pile burning, understory burning, a whole number of things. And I know a lot of you, including myself, volunteered your time to go out and, rake the old growth trees and really prepare the area for prescribed burning. So another thing that I want to point out, and this will come up quite a bit, is the monitoring and research network that's within the Caples Creek area. So you can see here on the map, there's a number of stars. These are the locations of the vegetation plots. And then we also have aspen monitoring in this area. So there's a lot of aspen vegetation, which, really needs a disturbance such as fire to elicit a response. And so we're really interested in monitoring those aspen moving forward. And this will come up a little bit later in the presentation, but you will note that there are a number of plots that fell outside the 2019 Caples fire. And so all of those plots have now burned within the 2021 Caldor fire. So we have a really interesting comparison setting itself up. Okay, so I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention something about the legacy tree monitoring. And I just wanted to do this for one purpose, and that's to remind people that we do have ongoing monitoring within the Caples area, looking essentially at the survival, vigor, and growth of those legacy trees. And so I think this is a really great opportunity for citizen science. I know the last couple of years haven't been that easy because of COVID, but it would be really wonderful, I think, to get people involved in continuing that monitoring effort on the legacy trees. Okay, so now we're going to jump in to talking about the 2019 Caples fire. And you will see quite a few of these moving forward. This is a fire severity map. And this is sort of our initial way that we look at the effects on vegetation as well as soil. And all of this is utilizing remote sensing data. So this is the RAVAGE program, the Rapid Assessment of Vegetation. And this is something that's supplied to all of the forest system lands that really helps us in our planning efforts moving forward. It gives us a better understanding of how vegetation was affected. And so here, for example, in red, you can see this is considered high severity, and then the green is considered low severity. And then there's shades in between, the light green and the yellow. And I'll point out that for high mortality, typically that's greater than 70%, 75% mortality. So if you consider, a stand, at least 75% of those trees would have been fire killed. Okay, so just to give everybody a quick recap on the 2019 Caples fire, it started in late September as a controlled burn. In early October, due to high winds, it was reclassified as a wildfire. So it largely stayed within the footprint of the proposed prescribed burn. And you can see from these photos here, these were taken at different times throughout the Caples fire and throughout some of the prescribed burning that happened prior to the Caples fire. Okay, so one of the things that I think is pretty interesting, and I'm going to roll through a couple of slides just to talk about fire effects following the 2019 fire. I think this is really important for people to understand what was happening within the Caples fire perimeter prior to the 2021 Caldor fire. So really what fire effects are desirable. And you can see this is a range of fire effects here. We've got low severity, where it's largely only affecting the understory within the stand. And then we have everything from high severity. And as I mentioned before, that's usually everything greater than 75% fire kill. So you can see in this example that most of those trees have been killed by fire. Okay, so let's talk about some of the results from the 2019 Caples fire. So one of the, I think, interesting points, and this is a lot of the work that Scott has been involved with, is really looking at the comparison between the prescribed burn and the wildfire within the 2019 Caples fire. And so you can see on the left panel here, this is the prescribed burn, and on the right, this is the wildfire portion of the burn. And so the takeaway from this figure is largely that the prescribed fire and the wildfire areas were fairly similar as far as fire severity. So this is just effects on vegetation. So you can see we have unchanged or low, moderate, and high fire severity. And so you can see the comparison between the prescribed burn and the wildfire is fairly similar. So the next thing to do is really think about how the Caples prescribed burn and wildfire portions really compare to other fires that we're seeing across the Sierra Nevada. And so this first comparison here, we have the prescribed burn on the left panel, and then it's compared to two fires that were managed for research benefit in Yosemite National Park, and then all fires here in the Southern Sierra. And this was derived from a publication by Meyer et al. In 2019. And the take-home message here is that the prescribed fire, the portion that burned under the prescription in the 2019 Caples burn, resulted in a burn severity fraction that falls pretty much closely in line with what we saw with those fires that occurred within the park system and those that occurred within the rest of the Southern Sierra Nevada. So if we look at the Caples, the wildfire portion of the Caples burn, and compare that to other fires in similar conditions that are occurring across California in mixed conifer forest, and then also compare it to a more recent fire where we saw sort of that increase in high fire severity, such as the King Fire. I think the takeaway here, is that the Caples wildfire had about 7% high severity compared to the King Fire, which was about 53% high severity. So pretty large difference between fire effects in the Caples wildfire and the King Fire. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about tree density. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, if anybody's interested in digging more into the 2019 fire effects, I would highly encourage you to watch the webinar that was recorded in 2019 by the California Fire Science Consortium. It really digs a lot deeper into all of these fire effects that are after the 2019 Caples fire. Okay, so if we look at tree density, let me just give you a quick overview of what is in this figure here. To begin with, on the left panel, we have prescribed burn. So this is the prescribed fire portion of the 2019 fire, and then the wildfire portion. And the first bar, the gray bar, is pre-fire, and then the second bar is post-fire. And so this is all trees per acre. And then this green bar here, that indicates the natural range of variability once again. So just as a reminder, that's those ranges that were quantified using historical records of tree density under a more naturally occurring fire regime. And so the one thing I'll note is that this is divided up into size classes of trees. So 3 to 8 inches diameter at breast height, up to greater than 31 inches diameter at breast height. And so really the takeaway message for here is that the wildfire portion of the Caples fire really did a good job at reducing those smaller diameter trees and bringing it closer to the natural range of variability. And both of the both the prescribed burn and the wildfire portion really did not decrease our large diameter trees at all. So really there was very little effect on trees greater than 24 inches in size. So now I just want to touch on fuel so that I think it's pretty important for us to understand whether or not we were changing the fuel dynamics within this landscape following the 2019 Caples fire. And so this is just looking at fine fuel reduction, pre, post, and then compared to NRV. And you can see in both cases of the prescribed burn and the wildfire portion of Caples 2019 fire, fine fuel loads were decreased. And then similarly, our coarse woody debris. So coarse fuels are anything that's greater than 3 inches in diameter. Heavy loading of coarse fuel really causes a strong resistance to control for firefighters. So it's really important to reduce. And so both the RX burn and the wildfire portions of the 2019 Caples burn brought coarse woody closer to NRV. So you can see we've had a reduction in both of those instances. Okay, so I think that really provides a good background for the sort of initial 2019 post-burn fire effects. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the species composition work that's been occurring within the Caples landscape, primarily because I'm talking to the California Native Plant Society, and I thought there would certainly be some interest in learning more about some of the work that's ongoing there. So we've been really fortunate to partner with the California Academy of Sciences for a number of monitoring and research questions that we'd like to address in the Caples fire. One of them is species composition. We had 2 interns that were able to work on this over the summer of 2020, and they'll continue to do so once we're able to get back in the field. So they were able to do a lot of photo vouchering, created species lists, and I think one thing I just want to point out is they were able to load all of this into iNaturalist. So those of you that use iNaturalist, there's a pretty good species list that's been developed that you can utilize within this landscape. But one of the priorities of the work they were doing was really to document species patterns across those severity types. So similar to what I've already mentioned, from low severity to high severity. And so the 2 interns collected data and then presented it. And I'll just give you a couple of slides and some of the work they presented. One of the things that they noted, I know you can't read this, not necessarily important. The only thing to note is that these are the forbs here, and you can see there's a lot of them, and you can see that there's a lot more of them in the post-fire landscape. And so they noted that based on that, it was important to really look at the species based on life form. And so they've sort of categorized them by forb, graminoid, shrub, and tree. And some of the initial results that they're seeing within the pre and the post-fire Caples landscape by that life form is, I think the one thing to note that I've already mentioned is that there was an increase in forbs across the landscape. But if you break that down by severity class, you can really see that a lot of that is being driven by the moderate and high severity, where you see a substantial increase in the forb-dominated communities. And so I will mention that a lot of this work will continue, and the intent was for them to have a more robust sampling of the floristics within the Caples burn, so by severity class. So hopefully we'll get some really great information partnering with the California Academy of Science. Okay, so now let's transition one more time and let's talk about the Caldor fire, which I think is a little more recent in a lot of our memories, definitely in a lot of our backyards. And essentially, I'm going to be very focused on how the Caldor fire interacted with the Caples footprint. But I do want to mention a couple of things before I sort of dive into that. The 2021 fire season was a very challenging one. We've had drought conditions for quite some time now. We also had high winds, high fuel loadings, and it really set the stage for not one, but 2 fires to cross the Sierra Nevada range, which is quite unprecedented. The Caldor fire was reported the evening of August 14th, in the Middle Fork Cosumnes Canyon. It expanded rapidly north and east and threatened over 30,000 structures. It closed 3 major highways. At the end of it, it burned 225,000 acres, and it affected a lot of our communities. In addition to that, I'll just mention that 216,000 acres was on the El Dorado National Forest, and about 8,600 was on the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit. The forest has been, largely engaged in suppression repair work and bear work, and will continue this, I imagine, for quite some time. So on the figure here that you're seeing, the map, this is just the outline of the Caldor fire and then the Caples footprint with the hash marks in blue. So I just want to point out a couple of things about the Caldor fire that I think are key characteristics. And, we're still learning a lot about the fire effects from this fire. It's still pretty recent. There's still a lot of work to be done and a lot of unanswered questions. But one of the key characteristics was the fire growth between August 15th and August 18th. So I'll just point this out here. This is around those dates. And if you look at this red line here, this is Daly acres, and you can really see how there was just an explosion of acres in those first couple of burn periods. And this really resulted in approximately a 30,000 acre high severity patch in the western half of the fire footprint. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I think one other interesting note of the Caldor fire is that it crossed a huge elevation range from approximately 1,700 feet to 9,800 feet. So it spanned a lot of vegetation types. So just to give you a sort of a brief overview of some of the effects that we're seeing in the 2021 Caldor fire before we sort of dive in to just focusing in on the Caples interaction. Well, first of all, I want to note, I did not put a Caples fire perimeter on here, but you can see it sort of outlined right in here where you have sort of that dark green color. And that's where, fire severity was largely unchanged. And once again, just to remind everybody, this is the rapid assessment of vegetation conditions. So this is done initially after the fire, and it's produced for all of the National Forest System lands. And it's a really key product that provides geospatial and tabular data and really helps us to standardize our vegetation mortality. So it ranges quite similar to the other figures that I've shown you, from a dark green, which is unchanged, to the red, which is high severity, so greater than 75% mortality. So a couple of things to note about this, and I'll just direct your attention also over to this figure on the right that shows essentially the same fire severity classes, and this is just the percent of the landscape within each of those fire severity classes. And then you'll see the hatched bars, and that's the range of variability, the natural range of variability. So in other words, we're comparing it to historic and reference conditions. And so fire severity across all vegetation types in the 2021 Caldor fire was 21% for unchanged, 20% for low, 19% moderate, and then 40% for high severity. So if you recall, the King fire was upwards of 50%. The Caldor fire really was no different. The majority of the high severity fire, as you can see, occurred in this western portion of the fire, primarily during those first few burn periods. So, and I think an interesting thing to note about how this compares to the natural range of variability, so these hatch bars, you can see that the unchanged and the moderate severity, and really the low severity as well, sort of occur within that lower band of the natural range of variability, whereas the high severity is far above what we would have seen historically. So another way that we look at effects on the landscape is by quantifying the patches of just high severity fire. So I've mentioned quite a number of times how fires that are burning currently are burning at a much higher percent of high severity. And so one way of looking at that is by patch size. And so this figure shows the patch sizes of high severity fires. So it ranges from 1 to 10 acres in size, which are these small little patches, which are really hard to see at this scale, up to this 10,000 acre patches in the dark red. And you can see from this figure that the patch sizes of high severity fire within the 2021 Caldor fire, really varied across the fire landscape. So this figure, once again, shows the patch sizes, and it's broken down by patch size classes. And on the left side, you can see the count, so that's just the number of patches. And on the right is the area, so the cumulative, the acres, essentially. And there's a couple of things to note here. High severity patches were represented, are typically our threshold for what constitutes a patch that's larger than the natural range of variability is 250 acres. So that's all of the patches over here on this right side. So if you look at sort of the smaller patches, those that are 1 to 10 acres in size, there's about 710 patches. So there's a lot of those small patches on this landscape. They make up a large proportion of the count of patches, but they only account for a very small percentage of the size of those patches. In contrast, if we look at those patches that are greater than 1,000 acres in size, which is over here on the right, those are only 6 patches, but they make up the vast majority of the area of the patches. And I think you saw that in the previous slide where we had just one contiguous patch of 30,000 acres. Okay, so now I want to transition into just talking about how the Caldor fire interacted with the Caples fire and really start to ask that question of whether or not the Caples fire was an effective fuel treatment. And so I just want to point out a couple of things. So you're watching a fire progression map. And so you can see here on the left, we have the date, and it'll just run through the date. And we're only looking at that portion of the fire that surrounded the Caples, the 2019 Caples fire footprint. And so a couple of things to point out on this map are just, I think most of us know this, but we have, major highway systems here. So we have Highway 50, we have 88, and then we have the Silver Fork Road and the Mormon Immigrant Trail, which I think a lot of us are probably familiar with in this landscape. And then the other thing to point out are these red lines. So these are all fire suppression lines that were utilized within the Caldor fire. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to sort of watch the fire progression. So one thing that I'm going to do is we'll bump onto some stills of some of the progressions and talk a little bit about each one. But some of the work that Scott's been doing is really talking to people that were directly involved with the suppression actions on the Caldor fire, particularly the division that was engaged around the Caples fire footprint. And those involved in making those decisions on firefighting strategy really said that the 2019 Caples fire footprint was a critical feature in controlling the fire. There was confidence that this area had reduced fuel loads and would provide a safe and viable location to operate from. They really felt that that footprint also offered a safety zone to retreat to if necessary. It was also effective as an anchor point to establish control lines running to the north towards Highway 50, which is this area right here, and then also towards the south toward Iron Mountain Road. There was confidence that the strategy was safe and viable, and they really expected that this was going to work to stop the fire's eastward progression. So some of the things that I just want to point out from the progression is on the northern portion of the Caples area, and I've talked about this a little bit, we had focused efforts on prescribed burning here. There's also a lot of other active forest treatments in this area. So there's a lot of logging roads, and this really made it accessible to the northwest of Caples to allow firefighters to slow the fire's progress. So we bump up a couple of days and we focus on the Silver Fork area. Initially, they were really successful at holding the fire along Silver Fork Road. Firefighting resources were sparse in this division of the fire, largely due to the high demand of resources for protection of populated communities. And not just on the Caldor fire, there were other fires occurring at this time as well. So eventually, there were a number of spot fires across Silver Fork. And this really, the fire really just pushed past Silver Fork Road at that point in time on August 29th. And then high winds really established the fire to the east on August 30th, and it pushed past those control lines to the north and the south of Caples. But as you can see here, we didn't have any movement into the Caples area on that northern edge. One of the things that was noted was that there were spot fires that were occurring within the Caples footprint, but a lot of them were really slow to grow, or they just put themselves out. So another really important thing to note is the infrastructure in the communities associated with Kirkwood and other areas along the Highway 88 corridor. The firefighters reported that although they were unable to stop the fire's eastward progress into that southeast corner of the fire, the Caples footprint really bought them time to do prep work. So they were able to insert firefighting resources to help protect cabins and other infrastructure in the vicinity of Silver Lake and Kirkwood. So one of the things that was really interesting, and I think some of us noted, on September 1st, you can see there was a bit of an incursion into the 2019 Caples fire. And this really caused concern as to whether or not the Caldor fire was able to reburn in Caples. And as it turned out, a lot of those fire perimeter maps were just mistaken, and they were interpreting spot fires as widespread fire growth here. And so I think you'll see, here, where the fire perimeter was actually corrected. And then I want to point one more thing out from the fire progression map. So a burnout operation occurred on that northeastern edge of the 2019 Caples footprint up in this area. And so that was, once again, the Caples footprint allowed for a good anchor point. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the preliminary analysis in really, starting to think about how and if the Caples 19 fire was successful as a fuel treatment. And so once again, we're going to take a look at some of the satellite-derived burn severity data. So once again, this is classified the same. So dark green unchanged and red as high severity. And so one thing I didn't point out earlier, and this might be a little hard for folks to see, but this is two pie charts that show tree-dominated and shrub-dominated fire severity. And you can see that a lot of the high severity fire within the 2019 Caples fire footprint was shrub dominated. And I think you can see that in the next figure here, where this map shows in hatch marks where we have chaparral dominated areas, as well as the dark gray, which is barren. And so you can really see in this figure, and it's worth noting, and I think it's of interest in really thinking about Caldor fire effects as well, whether areas were dominated by chaparral or forest type. And so you can really see that those chaparral dominated areas resulted in high severity fire. So one of the ways we're starting to think about how Caldor and Caples interacted is looking at a comparison of burn severity for the 2019 Caples fire, and then around the perimeter of Caples within the Caldor fire. So this is actually a half a mile buffer around Caples within the Caldor fire. And so here, one of the things we note almost immediately when you look at the initial Caldor fire severity map is that there was a lot higher fire severity on the southern portion of the Caples fire as compared to the northern portion of the Caples fire. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And that's pretty evident from these figures right here, where you can see in the Caldor fire perimeter a much higher percentage of high severity fire. It's almost approximately twice as much. But once again, a lot of that high severity pops up in that community as well. So the interesting thing is, and I think when I was preparing for this talk, was thinking about how we really can show visually the success of the 2019 Caples fire. And, you know, I although putting it on a map and putting the perimeter of Caples, I think is pretty successful in showing that we really didn't have any interaction. You know, Caldor did not burn into Caples. We did have a very small portion, and so you can see that here highlighted. And, you know, I think our main intent here is trying to understand where there was reburn, how that burn happened. And even though it's a very small portion of the Caples footprint that reburned during the Caldor fire, you can see here that a lot of it burned in patches primarily. There were some isolated areas of moderate and high burn severity, but most of the area, about 80% of it, burned at low severity or it didn't burn at all. So really, you know, the Caples fire footprint just stopped the Caldor fire. Okay, so I promised I'd go back and talk a little bit about the difference in the northern portion of the fire and the southern portion of the fire. And as I mentioned, it really stands out here that the burn severities between those two locations were very different. And one of the reasons, you know, this played out was that suppression was different on those two locations as well. Along with that, there could be a number of variables that we have yet to really explore, such as weather, fuel conditions, previous land management, topography. But the suppression actions that were taken during the fire on the northern and southern portions were definitely corroborated by firefighters. They were actively engaged in slowing the fire's progress on the northern portion of the fire. And this, you know, maybe resulted in reduced burn severity, as opposed to the southern end of the fire where growth was rapid. Firefighters were largely disengaged for their safety. There was some aerial firefighting which took place, but for the most part, ground forces weren't able to directly engage. And so it's likely that that resulted in higher fire severity as seen from these pie charts here. And so I think there may be some further exploration about just how suppression efforts impacted those two locations around the Caples fire footprint. So now I want to just transition a little bit and talk about some of the plot-based information that we have. One of the ways we were hoping to use the monitoring network out here was to evaluate those plots that burned within the Caldor fire. So I'm sort of indicating here where those plots are, and then there's some on the northern end of the fire, and compare them to those that burned in the 19 Caples fire. I think the real challenge there is that the conditions under which both of those fires burned were very different. So currently, we've just been evaluating the plots that burned in the Caldor fire to get a better understanding of just initial fire effects. So one of the ways we've been doing this, and I will say that we're pretty lucky in that we had some folks that were experienced drone flyers that volunteer to help us go out and document effects on the plots. And so you can see here, I have three slides that will show you the Caldor plots and how they range from low, moderate, and high severity. So in this panel, you can see we have the pre-Caldor, post-Caldor, and then this is the aerial photo via the drone for low severity. And so you can really get a sense for how the fire in this case really only impacted the understory. So not a lot of overstory was really affected at all. And then if we look at the moderate severity, we have the pre-Caldor, post-Caldor. It's a bit shady, so it's hard to make out some of those effects. But if you look at the aerial shot from the drone, you really start to see how, you know, about 50% of the overstory there was fire killed. And then the high severity, you know, doesn't paint a great picture, but we have the pre-Caldor, post-Caldor, and, you know, really from the ground photos, you don't get a great sense of how the overstory was affected. You can see the scorch on the trees, but you can't really see the canopy. And so the drone photos really give us great evidence on what's happening at sort of a bird's eye level. Okay, so now I want to just dive into a few of the quick results from the post-Caldor plot data. And so this is work that Scott Daly and his FBAT team collected late in 2021. So we're just beginning to sort of dive into analysis of some of this work. And one of the ways they initially evaluated those plots that burned in the Caldor fire was to look at vegetation burn severity using a method that's been developed by the National Park System. And so this is widely used to assess both soil, the substrate, and understory and overstory vegetation. And so it essentially ranges from unburned to heavily burned. And so I just want to take a quick look at the plots, and because we noticed the difference in the northern portion of the fire and the southern portion of the fire that surrounded Caples, if you recall, around the Caples fire footprint, we separated this analysis into north and south. So you can see in the top panels, we've got the north, and the bottom panels, the south portion. And then the first two here represent the substrate, so the effects on soil. And then the second panel represents the effects on the understory veg burn severity. And so you can really see that in the top panel, the northern portion of the fire, about 50% of the plots were burned at high severity, whereas in the southern portion of the fire, about 75% burned at high severity. So, definitely, once again, it sort of corroborates the findings from the satellite-based imagery that we're seeing, different effects on the vegetation in those two locations. And so likewise, if we look at the understory and overstory tree, so this is the canopy-based effects. You can see this is the northern portion, southern portion, and then understory tree and overstory tree canopy. And tree canopy change is based on field observation. So this is based at the plot level, really looking at scorch and torch percentages estimated for each species. And then it's categorized into the low, moderate, and high fire severity classes. And so you can see that the slide that shows the understory trees, we really saw a greater amount, quite a bit of understory tree canopy change in the southern portion of the fire. In the overstory, sort of a similar story, with the northern portion being much less than the southern portion of the fire. All right, so I just wanted to provide a few quick conclusions, and I wanted to talk about some next steps in future monitoring and research efforts within this landscape. I think just from a basic, fire summary, I hope that people, really sort of understood and put into context how fires are currently burning. They're increased high severity, and Caldor was no exception to this rule. So it's kind of falling in with what we've been seeing in other fires across the Sierra Nevada. The Caples fire, however, was a bit different, and it was very successful in shifting the vegetation closer to what would have occurred under a more natural fire regime. And so one of the things I really wanted to place here as a question is really just, is the 2019 Caples fire an effective fuel treatment? I think from a fire management perspective, at least the observations that we heard, and in that location where the fire was, it was likely successful at fire management. It certainly gave them a good place to a safety zone and a place where they could set up anchor points to assist them in fire management. From a fire behavior perspective, I think yes, in some cases. I think when we look at some of the initial results and the comparison between the northern portion, north of the Caples fire and south of the Caples fire behavior was very different. So I think there's a bit more to dig into to understand that. And I think the same can be said about fire effects on vegetation. I think it's very dependent on location. I think one thing we can say is that the Caples fire definitely prevented the Caldor fire from burning into it. And, the one question I think that always comes to my mind is, and probably a lot of our minds with regards to our fuels projects, is just longevity. And it is good to note that the Caples fire was only 2 years old, so there hadn't been a lot of regrowth in the area. And so it's interesting and I think important to evaluate longevity of these treatments as well as placement and size of them. So I just want to talk a little bit about next steps. And one of the things that I think we're really interested is continuing to evaluate the field treatment effectiveness. I will point out that Dana Walsh provided a number of briefs on the El Dorado National Forest that covered other fuel treatments across the landscape, and they're really great at highlighting their success at sort of answering those first two questions. So whether or not they were effective from a fire management perspective and fire behavior. The fire effects have yet, I think, to be evaluated. And that's something that we'll be focused on in 2022 is field monitoring that will be looking specifically at fuel treatment effectiveness. And so that's really focused on that fire management question from a fire behavior standpoint, but really on the fire effects. Another, I think, key thing in understanding fuel treatment effectiveness, particularly of the Caples fire, is evaluating fire behavior models. So I'm going to bump to the next slide here. So one thing that we did within the Caples Creek watershed when we were in the planning effort was really look at fire simulations under certain weather conditions. So this is just one example where we simulated a fire that started to the west of the Caples Creek watershed. And this was largely based in an untreated fuel condition. And so this showed us that there was, the potential for aggressive and intense surface fire behavior and crown fire potential. And so one of the things I really, would like to do is explore using fire behavior models, the impact of the Caldor fire within the Caples landscape had it been untreated. And that's something that we did do, within that fire behavior modeling, but the conditions that we looked at were not equivalent to what we saw in the Caldor fire. And I think that might be one way of better understanding whether or not the Caples fire would have been successful had it not existed. Some of the other sort of next steps in future monitoring. So as I mentioned, we have a pretty robust monitoring and research network in this landscape. We have partnerships with the California Academy of Sciences. We've been working with the Pacific Southwest Research Station on a number of things beyond just vegetation monitoring. We're also looking at effects on avian species and small mammals, and really trying to understand what is driving resilience in this landscape. And I think the one thing that I'll end on is that when we developed this project and we developed the monitoring network and we started looking at how we were going to evaluate some of these effects, we've had these multiple disturbances now. And so we have sort of an interesting study set up for us. We just need to figure out how to evaluate all the specific questions with regards to the Caples landscape. And so I'll end with some acknowledgements. There's a lot of people that have been involved in this project from the very beginning. They're not all included here. A few that I wanted to recognize were just our field crews that have collected a lot of this data over the last several years in 2019, and then again in 2020 and 2021. And then the interns from the Cal Academy of Sciences that did some of the floristics work for us, Haley and Natalie. And with that, I will pause and answer any questions to the best of my ability.
Thank you, Becky. So people can either ask questions through the chat, or you can try raising your hand and we'll try to see you, but the chat might be the best at this point.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that people should have been dropping their questions in the chat, or if they just had any lingering issues. So yep, if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Oh, I
So
see it.
John,
Yeah.
John Sakura had a question. If you want to unmute yourself, John.
Is he able to unmute himself?
Let me try. See, maybe not.
How's that?
Oh, there we go.
That's good.
I'm referring to the past 15 years worth of fuels reduction projects. Our chapter of Trout Unlimited in the El Dorado Forest has been walking a number of those projects and commented on a number of them. And by my guesstimation, just looking at what's transpired, they didn't seem to have much effect on what happened when the Caldor hit. I know you're talking about doing further evaluation, and I'm just going to ask you, can you maybe put together a map, look at the years when the fuels reduction projects were actually completed, and what was taken out, and what was actually done, and how effective were they, if any, when a fire like Caldor comes through? And if they're not effective, then what would you recommend for future projects? I mean, the Caples Creek fire, you're using that as an example, but really that was a fire that was out of control. You burned a lot more than you ever intended to. And had you only burned what you intended to burn, would it have had how much of an effect would it have had on the Caldor? Would it have slowed it down as much as, it wouldn't be as much as we saw, but it would probably have been some. I guess my question is, how effective are these fuels reduction projects that the forest has been implementing for years to pretty much no avail? Or do they need to continue on top of them, and at what expense? You know, rambling question, but hopefully you get my point.
Oh, no, I can completely understand your question, and it's a great question. And I think, yeah, I mean, I know that there's examples in Caldor as well as Dixie Fire where, you know, we really anticipated that the treatments would have been more successful. So I think there's some consideration of longevity and also size of treatments. And I think another important consideration is just whether or not we are, you know, implementing prescribed fire following a lot of our mechanical treatments as well to continue to maintain the fuels. But no, I think some of the things you mentioned are specifically some of the things we're going to be evaluating. And you know, it's interesting to note that we did a lot of fuel treatment effectiveness work, and a lot was published about 10 years ago, in sort of the assumption that, you know, we had all the answers. And at that time, fires were, I don't know, maybe 20,000 acres in size was like a big fire. And, you know, now we're seeing fires that are 250, 500, you know, very large fires. And I think it's, you know, probably time to reevaluate sort of what we thought was effective and what we're seeing now.
Thank you.
And then Becky, we have a question from Howard too, who wants to know, do you know what fire treatments are anticipated now with increasing funds?
What, can you repeat that one more? Oh, I see it. Okay.
With the increasing funds that are coming, do you know what the fire treatments are now anticipated to be?
Well, I think within the state of California, there's a lot of funds that are being you know, really allocated, and the objective is fuels treatments. And so I anticipate there will likely be an increase in a lot of the work that's happening across the Sierra Nevada, and particularly in this province as well. So I think stay tuned. I mean, I'm hopeful, you know, that I've seen all these, you know, the 10-year strategy for the US Forest Service just came out. You know, the state of California has a strategy in place, and they're all sort of committed to increasing the pace and scale within the landscape. So I think there's a lot of hope that, you know, the funds will be there and the work will get done. So great question.
Yeah, thank you. And then Catherine Schiaffolo, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question yourself. I'm not sure I understand it totally, so maybe you could ask your question.
Sure. One of the things is we were sitting in OES and, we're trying to keep abreast of the rate the fire was moving eastwardly. And, we were looking at the fact that we had a lot of clear-cut areas in certain areas and a lot of unlogged areas in other areas, and of course the Caples Creek area. And what we didn't really know, and we were trying to look 3 or 4 days out, was whether we were going to be burning faster for those areas that had been clear cut, say 5 or 10 years ago. And, we know from experience that most of those were pretty high grassy areas.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I haven't done a lot of work looking at clear cuts necessarily, but I think there's a lot of information out there that depending on how the fire is burning, particularly some of the fires we've seen lately, that even, they're maybe not able to move through clear cuts, but the fires are spotting far beyond those clear cut areas. But, I would think that from a fire management perspective, at least they would serve, as long as they were, large enough or contiguous enough as a place for, safe and effective management to happen.
Yeah, it's just something to think about because, we have all the dried grasses and then, we have all these young trees, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years old trees. And, are the grasses going to ignite the young trees? And then
Yeah.
on.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I know we've evaluated some of our, the plantations that we have within the Forest Service. And, it does depend on the way the fire is burning. I think in some cases, if they're, managed regularly and frequently, then, there isn't much of a chance of them, burning into the smaller trees.
So,
And then it looks like
I just want to bring into mind that, when we're planning evacuations for people, we have to figure out how these young trees might be burning.
Yeah, agreed.
And I think we have one last question out, which is from Lester.
Yeah, Becky, I was curious in the Fleming Meadow and Jenkinson Reservoir, Slide Park Lake area, where you had several different age projects that have taken place, one just having been completed, but you also probably had a lot of suppression going on. Anyways, whether that area, if there's information of kind of how some of the treatments affected the progression of the fire, of the Caldor fire.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some preliminary analysis looking at those particular areas and them being successful. But I don't have any specific information related to that. It will be something that we'll evaluate closer, I'm sure.
And is there an opportunity for volunteers in the future to assist with any of that assessment and or data collection?
I'm not sure about that. That's a really good question. It's certainly something I'll consider and pass along as to whether we can utilize volunteers in some of that work.
All right, well, thank you so much. It was so interesting. I think we all really appreciate your explaining that all so well. Thank you very much. I think give a hand here to Becky. And thank you so much, Becky.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Great presentation.